Ah.
I guess we're almost all here. We may as well begin. It's a little early, a little headline. Would you have at hand, please, that vow formula that I passed out yesterday? We might use it in our prayer at the end. So let us reflect again for a moment that we are in the presence of the God that Jesus taught us to call our Father. That Jesus, whom we call our brother, has promised to be with us all day. That he has sent his Holy Spirit to be our advocate and to teach us all the truth. And together we might recite the first paragraph of this formula of consecration. Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, prostrate with the most profound respect before your infinite and adorable majesty, I consecrate myself entirely to you, to reveal your glory as far as I am able, and that you will require of me. St. John Baptist, still Sal. Pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts. Today being what it is, I thought I'd wear my Uncle Sam costume. Have to preserve something of the holiday. Although with me so far this morning, many things have gone wrong, including the fact that the copier is out of toner. A couple of brothers asked if they could have a copy of the notes that I used for that homily on the Holy Brothers the other night. Would anybody else want a copy? Can I make one for everybody?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. I transcribed them into barely legible form on one page, but they're sketchy, but it might be helpful sometime for you. On the reading assignment, in view of the adjustment we made, in view of the fact that you have all these days ahead of you with nothing to do, those pages that I suppressed for today, of course, cannot remain suppressed forever. So on number 13, first of all, it's only a small reading assignment. So the new center at Rouen, Bland begins to develop that in those pages that we originally skipped anyhow. So add to that section Bland 2-3, pages 13 to 39, and pages 52 to 95. That covers the expansion of the Institute throughout France. And so we can treat that all in one fell swoop. Notice, please, that that's for Monday, but notice for Tuesday, for Tuesday and Wednesday, for all of next week, that means that you still have about 130 pages of Bland to get through for those days, and also an extensive number of pages in encounters. I think you all have a copy of that, huh? Because Bland is very difficult to follow in some of these things, whereas I think those pages in encounters will help you to understand a little better the problem of the founders' flight to the south. All right. Gus and I, well, you could say, collaborated in putting that together, although maybe argued or disputed with one another over what it meant might be a little somewhat more accurate. All right, well, we had to rush that last section so rapidly yesterday. I got off on a lot of autobiographical nonsense, and we did want to dwell a bit on that, on the rule and all of the vows and so on in 1694, but I don't think maybe we should pass over quite so quickly this expansion period, and if we take a closer look at it maybe today for a few minutes anyhow, we can highlight some of the things. Now, all this trouble that develops between De La Salle and the church authorities and De La Salle and the educational authorities in some ways has its roots in the establishment of this teacher training college. And first of all, he moves to the Grand Maison. Now, the Grand Maison houses a novitiate, and it's here that he's able also to open this very important Sunday school for teachers. And so this is now this was a work, and of course this is the source of a good bit of trouble between De La Salle and Chétardy, and it's also a source of trouble with the writing masters to some extent. But apparently this was an idea conceived of by Chétardy. I think you'll learn next year when you take Buttimer 2 from Brother Jared Rummery. He's done a lot of investigation into Chétardy independently of his relationship with De La Salle and what kind of a character he was as the pastor of St. Sulpice and the reputation he had for as a good catechist and for creative catechetical enterprises in his parish. And this was one of them. That since so many of these lads had to leave school at the age of 10 or 11, and maybe even earlier, and then go out to work and working in these very menial jobs all the time, that was the end of their formal education. They had no way of advancing themselves, and it was the end of their religious formation. So he conceived this idea of opening up a Sunday school, whereby they'd come and they'd have a catechism lesson, and then he would arrange to have them instructed in useful things. Some of it fairly advanced for those who were advanced enough. For those who had very little education, it helped to bring them to literacy. For those who had already achieved a certain amount of literacy, lessons in drawing and geometry and things like that would be practical for them, were taught in this thing. And he figured the brothers, this was an ideal thing for the brothers to get involved in. So in a sense, it's a first step out of the world of elementary education for the brothers, and has a certain importance for that reason. And Chétardy entrusts it to them. So it's important not to skip over this whole business of the teacher, of the Sunday school, the Sunday Academy as it was called. So there's two things here at the Grand Maison. It now houses the novitiate and the Sunday Academy. Now, some authors talk as if there was also a teaching, and it's dedicated to St. Cassian, the guy who got stuck with the pens. So we have the Sunday Academy and the novitiate. At the same time, he sends Vuillard to conduct this teacher training center in the Faubourg, or the area of Saint-Marcel. We did talk about that a little bit. And Bland's frightful judgment on Vuillard when the thing folds up. And of course, it's forced to fold up because of this business with the educational establishment. And the whole thing with the educational establishment was that both in the novitiate, where the brothers were being trained, and in the teacher training center in St. Hippolyte, that the brothers were being taught, not only being taught writing, but were being taught to teach writing. And of course, that gave the writing masters a wedge to act against De La Salle. So that's that. So in this period, in this 3 or 4 year period, there's a lot that's happening. But what's also happening, while we have to in the biography give a tremendous amount of attention to what's happening to De La Salle in Paris in his conflict with these two powerful groups who almost ruined the whole enterprise in Paris. Again, he isn't taking the attitude that the whole thing hinges on Paris. He's already begun to expand, first of all at the invitation of his classmate from Saint-Sulpice, Bishop Desmarais. And that proves to be an important center. The schools thrive there, gets 7 brothers altogether, if I remember correctly. But Desmarais, like Letellier, like Chétardy, and like all of them, is willing to support the brothers and so on, but on his own terms, and to try to dictate the internal affairs of the Institute. So there are 3 key elements in Desmarais. Desmarais was, he had a reputation, as Boyan says, he was death on heretics, especially the Quietists. He had a big thing on that. So he was a champion of Roman Orthodoxy, again, coming out of the same spiritual formation as De La Salle, Bland, all the rest of them. So he's kind of an important person, but he's a comfortable prelate. His archiepiscopal palace is still there, again, like the one in Paris. It's now a museum. You can go there and see the place where he had the founder into dinner and locked the doors on him so he couldn't get out. He gave him a new mantle and so on. But one of his big things was he would go around to the brothers and he'd comfort them when they were sick, and he'd provide them with little goodies and things like that and so on. He was continually after De La Salle to treat them more leniently. He has that wonderful expression. Can I put my finger on it? Page 169. We're in the second volume still. About 5 lines down from the top of the page. He was no enemy to penance and a zealous promoter of evangelical austerity, as one can see from his admirable letter against the false spirituality of the time, Quietism. He warned the brothers to restrain their favor so that it might last longer, and to wait for God's time to offer the sacrifice of the lives, without trying to anticipate God's decree. He told them that if they did not wish to fatten the victim before immolating it, they should at least nourish it. It's a cute little expression. So then he brings De La Salle to dinner. On the top of the next page, 170, after the meal, the Bishop of Chartres and Monsignor d'Aubigné. Now we're going to meet him because eventually he will become the Archbishop of Rouen. And he's the one who revokes the founder's faculties when the founder's on his deathbed. And there's going to be some problems with d'Aubigné. And d'Aubigné was not too enthusiastic about this De La Salle person at all. He didn't think he was properly dressed, and he didn't like his shabby clothing and everything else, and so on and so forth. And he and the bishop colluded to try and dress him up a little bit and give him a new mantle at least. But d'Aubigné never had any great enthusiasm for the brothers, apparently. Notice, by the way, for those of you who are used to American ecclesiastical terminology, Monseigneur most of the time means a bishop. Some of them may have been domestic prelates, but and of course in Ireland, do they still use the expression "my lord"? Which is it translates literally. So, for example, when the Pope names cardinals, when he calls us, I was there when he made the last bunch, not this most recent one. And when he announced the names of them all, he would say, Monsignor, what's his name? John O'Connor, and Monsignor, Archbishop of New York, will now be a cardinal. So Monsignor really means my lord, and it's appropriately the title of a bishop. And it gets applied to any prelate. So when you see Monsignor, you always see the cardinal called Monsignor de Noailles. It's not a Monsignor in the sense in which we use it in this country. So now whether d'Aubigné was only a domestic prelate or a bishop at this point is hard to say exactly, but he could well have been a bishop also, an auxiliary bishop to the Bishop of Chartres. Of course, Chartres, where that marvelous cathedral is, needless to say, that's still there, and it was there in the founder's time, and it was a center of devotion to Our Lady. But the big thing, of course, is this provides us with another memoir of the founder, which Blanc gives us at great length. We don't have the original of this, but Blanc gives us pretty much the complete text. And here again, beginning on page 171, you can tell immediately the difference between something that comes from the founder and something that comes from from Blanc. Beginning on the bottom of 171, he lists there the 9 points from the memoir on teaching, why it's better to teach French rather than Latin. You can get something of the founder's personality out of this too, I think, Gus, because it's extremely practical.
Yeah, legal. Fine mind.
Yeah,
making legal decisions.
Yeah, you're more enthusiastic about that aspect than I am, but and I'm not completely convinced of it, but I can't. Obviously, it makes sense. But it's very precise, and this is, I think, typical of the founder. And it doesn't have the diffusion of Blanc, but it's very, very practical and down to earth. And the whole point is why teach them something that they're never going to use, and why not teach them something that they'll be using for the rest of their life, especially because it opens them up to catechetical instruction and makes it possible for them to continue their religious education. That's an important element here for it. And then he says, nothing's worse than people who know a little Latin and try to use it. They only make a laughingstock out of themselves. And I guess most of us have had some experience with that. The other problem he had, again, the bishop, here he's got under his control in a sense. These bishops give their money, but they want to get their money's worth. So he's got all these wonderful, religious, very edifying people go piously around the town, and above all, when they're in church, just models of of reverence for the holy mysteries and all that. So why not get your money's worth and have them go around on every Sunday to different parishes so people can see the way they ought to behave in church and be edified and get a share in the good example and so on. I said, no way. The brothers are, first of all, they're supposed to spend the morning bringing their pupils to class, and the afternoon is the only community time they have together. Very interesting on this occasion that should come out until it was time for Vespers. But that was important community time for the brothers to be together back in the house. So he didn't want them traveling all over the city trying to visit these various parishes and stuff. Then, as Blanc does, well, a lot of writers have flashbacks. Blanc is full of these flash forwards all the time. So he carries the Chartres thing all the way to the conclusion, even to the getting of letters patent, the trouble with the nephew of the bishop who becomes a successor, and another struggle here with the writing masters, and the whole problem again of defining who are the poor. And Blanc, when Blanc gets going on that business of the poor, he misses the founder's point, I think, completely every time. We'll say more of that a little later. And then finally, the plague in 1705 in Chartres carried away a good number of the brothers, including some of the troublemakers, especially that famous director of novices. But that's jumping way ahead of the thing. Okay, so so there's some importance there. And Calais, well, Calais is interesting for several points of view. First of all, Blanc makes a big comparison between the founder's attitude towards Chartres, where he was very cautious and got the brothers in to ask them what they thought. Maybe he was a little afraid that he might be operating out of friendship for the bishop. But he seems to have responded with somewhat more enthusiasm to the chance to go up to this channel city of Calais, right on the English Channel. And of course, this leads again into an adaptation into something, I suppose, that might be called vocational training, because it's in Calais where he adapts the courses to the needs of the young men, most of whom would be involved in the maritime industry as sailors or some such capacity. The development of the story is interesting. These two priests named Pouthon, the older one, the older pastor, the younger one studying in Paris, and the younger one studying in Paris writes back to him and says, oh, you should see what these brothers are like here in Paris. Oh, get them for me, he says. So then the founder's interested. He starts negotiations. The Duke of Bethune, who was the governor of the place, is living in Paris as most of the bar. They never stayed home. And so he meets him at Mass, and then he goes to Mass, sees this pious layman and so on, and then goes to listen, recognizes him. Oh, he's all turned on by that. Then Bethune's son, the Duke of Chartres, is very helpful to the brothers and so on. The Bishop de Langle gets involved. Now we'll see more of him later on too, because he becomes one of the appellants against Jansenism. And we have this very interesting lay character named Monsieur Jans, who becomes a big friend of De La Salle and comes to visit him at St. Jean. Let's take a look at a couple of those things. Page 1, I love the thing on page 180, especially in terms of what I'm doing to you folk. The third paragraph from the top. This was the last service that Pouthon rendered to the brothers, because he died. Did I leave the N out of the name there on the board? No. Because he died shortly after this, and his nephew, in whose favor he had resigned his position, survived him only a few months. So the two of them died. This young ecclesiastic, a most promising youth, died when he was still in Paris, continuing his studies with perhaps too much ardor. His eager application to study caused him to find a premature death because of his too great earnestness. Everybody else is assiduous, but Brana hasn't got any kind words for this one. It seems that he would still be among the living had he known how to moderate a desire which, while noble and rare, leads those who yield to it to an early grave. Wow. His death, which was the price he paid to purchase knowledge. and that of his uncle, which had occurred, were deeply regretted. So don't study too hard. You all disappeared very quickly from that party last night. Was it the singing that drove you away? As usual, I closed the thing up. As a matter of fact, it lasted beyond the closure. I didn't get back till 11:30. So some of the wear and tear may show as the morning goes along. All right. So that's a cute one. And then on page 181, I mentioned this yesterday. Again, about in the middle of the page, about Louis XIV. As zealous for good works as he was for the promotion of religion, granted an alms to the brothers as a result of the request made to him. And in the next 2 years, they received 450 livres, derived from the sale of the property that had belonged to the expelled Calvinists. A similar favor was granted to them at the request of the Duke of Bethune. So then it's out of this foundation. Now, this bishop, of course, was the bishop, not Calais was not an episcopal city. It was Boulogne-sur-Mer, which was the episcopal city where the bishop was, and eventually the founder was able to open schools there. What do you think on page 185 of this Monsieur Jeance? Huh? A lover of all good works, he was either their author, their promoter, their helper, or their advisor. His zeal for the Catholic faith made him so well known that it won for him the honorable commission of keeping watch over the Huguenots and of finding out what they were doing. This at a time when the public exercise of their religion was forbidden in France. Thus, while wearing secular attire, he acted in some sort as an inquisitor of the faith. As a vigilant sentinel in the house of the Lord, he devoted himself to driving away from it the wolves dressed in sheep's clothing, or else help the strayed sheep to come back. After public Protestant preaching had been forbidden, he showed himself admirably active in going here and there to seek out the preachers and the false pastors. He found out about their gatherings and the places where they assembled, so as to have them persecuted and thus oblige them to depart from the country. He probably edited a newspaper, too, that he circulated around with the name The Wanderer. So this activity brought him everywhere, that the Huguenots, even ever on the move, all over Flanders, because the Calvinists were very strong in Holland. On page 186, that would be, if you wanted to write a paragraph on the brother's vocation or the characteristics of the brother's vocation or the brother's school, what would you think of this paragraph with quotes around it? And so on. The quote is attributed to Jeance, but it's worth taking a look at it in case you skipped over it. You take your place as harvesters in the Lord's vineyard, and if you are not among the first invited to labor there, you have at least been called to work in the most abandoned corner of it. You are like the gleaners who hasten after the reapers to gather the stalks which have been neglected and trodden underfoot. Your consolation is that there are so many of these that you can pick them up by the handfuls and with them fill the granary of our Heavenly Father. If you do not stand at the altar, if you do not preach from the pulpit, at least you're not supposed to, if you do not sit in the tribunal of penance nor officiate at baptisms, if your work does not put a censer in your hands to offer incense to the Most High in the temple, at least you have the honor of preparing living temples for him and to labor at the sanctification of the most abandoned children. If your ministry is less showy than others, it is also the least exposed to danger. That's true too. That's how I managed to survive as a moral theologian in this age. If in the church there are more honored roles, there are scarcely any more useful ones. She possesses plenty of monks and religious, but she lacks catechists dedicated by their stated vocation to the instruction of youth. When you teach Christian doctrine, you are doing the work of the apostles. As you know, their zeal led them all over the world to preach and proclaim the faith. You know, too, that prayer and the preaching of the doctrine of Jesus Christ were the two features of the ministry that they considered the most worthy of their attention as apostles. They rid themselves of all other occupations, even those directed to the corporal works of charity, so as to dedicate themselves unreservedly to these two. St. Paul concentrated on these same activities, and he himself declared that heaven had sent him to evangelize and to teach Christian doctrine. That's not bad. That's pretty good. I wouldn't want you to miss that. Page 186, also on that same page. Is it 186? That's the wrong thing. Page 182. His description of sailors is pretty good. This is Bly first. The court gained was the sections in the middle, separate from the rest of the city. These people who usually receive in their youth neither education nor instruction. They're religious at heart, but their religion is somewhat sui generis, since they make it up for themselves. Their children are accustomed to see from their early years, and thus become like their parents, men who might be mistaken for half men or for talking animals, if one did not know that they have immortal souls. Nearly all of them are born with a propensity for the fisherman's trade or for sailing, and thus by instinct and by natural inclination they follow the vocation of their fathers. When they can scarcely talk, they already know how to handle the oars and are glad to go to sea. Since their ignorance is profound, they are usually as silent about religion as the fish they catch. And when they do undertake to speak of it, they do so with the awkwardness natural to them. Rarely do they observe it correctly without superstitious practices. It was then very important to provide for these poor children of the mariners the means of receiving instruction that their parents were unable to give them. But it really creates a lovely climate of this very, very different type of situation in which the brothers now find themselves up there on the English Channel. Okay. Troyes, I guess Troyes is southeast of Paris, but it's still in the province of, the old province of Champagne. And eventually 3 schools are set up there, and all the negotiations and so on, again by the zealous preaching of an Oratorian. The thing continues. It's interesting to visit Troyes and see those churches where the brothers and the rectories where they live. They're all still standing. I was able to get there one time. And this becomes important because the copy we have of the rule of, am I right on this, Gus? The copy we have of the rule of 1718 is the one that was sent to the community at Troyes by Brother Bartholomew. And so this was an important place, I guess, for that reason, maybe. Rome, if you go to page 191, now we had a long discussion on this last night, so we don't have to spend too much time on it. But it's interesting to look on page 191 at the reasons Blanc gives of why the founder sent the thing. Now remember, Blanc is writing in 1730, so 31, 32, 5 or 6 years after the Institute already has the Bull of Approbation. So, of course, he's really writing, and he's writing as a canonist, and he still has that notion of religious orders. Hernandez can't help refuting him in the footnote on number 3, to prepare himself, to prostrate himself at the feet of the vicar, to ask his approbation for the rules and constitutions, and for the brothers the privilege of making the 3 solemn vows of religion. And of course, I think that all of that is totally foreign to the founder's mentality at the time he sends the 2 there. As he said, and Blanc, I think, even misinterprets the founder's dying words about the reason why he sent them there. But it's interesting. This is a typical Blanc argumentation. And it's interesting to see the reasons he gives. But it's very ecclesiastical and very as if we can hardly wait to have the. Blanc in his thinking has already got the brothers categorized into some kind of an accepted religious order, and I think that the advantage of all of the research that Maurice Hermans and Boutet and all of them, it's a great emphasis in Michel Savage, is the precise originality of what the founder was doing. That there was nothing like this in church life until he came along, and most of it was intact with the Bull of Approbation, except the fiddling around with the vows. But the tendency in the Institute, though, even in asking for the Bull of Approbation, was more and more to want to, and certainly in the 19th century, the superior generals, their whole approach to spirituality and everything else was increasingly tied into Jesuit spirituality particularly, and maybe a fair amount of monastic spirituality. And then with Rome trying to, beginning in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and right up to this present day, trying to set up characteristics of religious life defined a priori, where they're all the same, it's easier for Rome to control them that way. But I think that there's some writing that's beginning to develop, even outside of ourselves, trying to point out that the genius of various religious congregations is the genius and the charism of the founders, each one of whom had something very different and something unique in view, and ours certainly did at that point.
Excuse me, just on that, in terms of the originality, how different was the order at that time from, let's say, women congregating?
Well, the founders of women order had a similar problem, because according to church canonical requirements and so on, if they were going to be a congregation of women, they had to be cloistered, and they had to take solemn vows. And so Vincent de Paul, for example, that's why he calls his women the daughters of charity. And they never, and they still to this day do not take perpetual vows. They renew them annually. And so all those founders, and Fourier, now in the diocesan orders, the same thing with the Sisters of the Infant Jesus, those founders and foundresses had to work outside of that. That's one of the problems the founder had in getting with his patent for those sisters. I don't know if that...
Yeah, so in other words, you wouldn't believe the same pledge unless it counted as a lay religious congregation?
For men, yes. This had been happening with the women, yet founders of women's orders had been wiggling their way around this for a good long while, but the founder, I think, is the first one who successfully does it with a group of men.
Interesting that Sal had such a great respect for the practices of the religious life.
Yes.
And yet, like Vincent de Paul, did not want to be confined by the juridical dimension.
Yeah. First, that raises, we can get all these problems. That raises the other question about what Ollier was doing at Saint-Sulpice, because what he was effectively doing there in that seminary for diocesan priests was to impose a monastic discipline on them. And priests today are beginning to say, when they raise questions about seminary formation for diocesan priests, why do they lock us in the seminary for 2 years of philosophy and 4 years of theology and run us through a monastic routine, which is totally different from what we're going to live for the rest of our life as pastors? Yeah? But, so it was the same problem in a certain sense with the Sulpicians training parish priests as with the founder, bringing so much of that tradition of religious life into the thing. Of course, the point, however, I think, is to make sure that there is that balance, that if it's all just professional activity and work and so on, and isn't infused with an intense religious spirit, both corporately and personally, I think that's a very important thing, and that's why he makes the spirit of faith and zeal. See, I think that his way out of that is that integration between the faith and the zeal and the community life type of a thing. Okay, a word about Avignon. Now, I hope it's clear to you all, and Glenn makes it clear, or Hernandez does, at least in the footnote, that Avignon in the south of France, just about an hour's drive away from Marseille, it's not far, it's on the Rhone River, not far from the Mediterranean. This whole territory was part of the Papal States. It was not under the jurisdiction of the King of France, and therefore it belonged to the Pope. Now, of course, at this period, the Pope owns all of the central part of Italy, the Papal States, and this territory around Avignon, where the popes were in two periods in the 14th century. That was the center of the papacy until Catherine of Siena got them back to Rome, and then you had that split afterwards, and then they were back there for another decade or two until the Council of Constance in 1415. So Avignon, and the Papal Palace is still there. You can still visit it. It's an enormous thing, And the cardinals didn't like to live in the Papal Palace, so they all had their palaces on the opposite side. So Avignon remained a papal city under papal control and papal jurisdiction during all that time. So, of course, the reason why the founder was delighted to open a school there was this gave him a foothold. This was almost the same thing as having a school in Rome. That's another thing to think about when we think about Droland. Droland was under the eyes of the papacy, but so were the schools in Avignon, no question about that. And that didn't do us any harm when the Bull of Approbation was being negotiated. That the officials in Rome knew, because we were in papal territory when we were in Avignon. So the success of the schools there was a very, very important element, an important factor until De Salle sends brothers there. And he makes that the center for the brothers of the southern province, and that's where Ponce had his headquarters all the time. He was in charge of the brothers of the south. Okay, so don't miss. What's the name of the woman whose husband carried out her dying wishes to establish a school? What's his name? What's the name of the layman who put up all the money to get the brothers in Avignon? Mr. Whitehouse! Chateau Blanc. Huh? Did you miss that? So it's Mr. Chateau Blanc who makes all the negotiations. And who helps him? Who is the one who gets to the founder? Who's the contact with the founder? Didn't you read this stuff? It's Gerard Droland. On his way back from Rome. He didn't last very long with his brother. Gabriel's brother, on the way back, goes back to the founder, passes through Avignon. This is the route. And so Mr. Whitehouse says, when you get back to the founder, see what you can do about getting some brothers here. So Droland goes and sees the founder and tells him this wonderful opportunity, the money's there for Avignon and so on and so forth. And then he says, oh, by the way, I'm leaving the Institute. Land talks about dispensations every once in a while, by the way, from these vows when people quit. But there was no question of a dispensation in those days because, again, they were not public vows in the church. There's one mistake on page 196, which shows, again, how unreliable Blain is when he tosses these things around, because he so often writes about the way things are at his time. But then he talks about Monseigneur Francois Maurice de Gontarie. That's the wrong one. He was the bishop. He was the papal legate at Avignon at the time of the Bull of Approbation. It was Archbishop Fieschi, who later on became a cardinal, who was the bishop at the time. Yves Boutet has a big long thing on that. Okay, so that I think, and page 194, we get another mention. To build up to the next act here. Down at the bottom of page 194, the founding of the schools in Avignon, he says, and it's wonderful things, but the destruction is on the way. We shall see the highest and most respectable authority strike the shepherd, intimidate the sheep, undertake them to place them under a stranger's direction, strive to keep them disunited, cause several of them to grow disenchanted little by little, and alter the form of government. It's a complete summary of everything there. All this was due to the intrigues of a highly placed personage who enjoyed great prestige and a notable reputation, who, from being a protector, became his most bitter antagonist. De Salle, obliged to flee before him, had to leave his flock to the care of Providence, and the enemy of the virtuous founder took advantage of his absence to attempt to set aside his rules, etc., etc., etc. So we come to page 199. Yes.
Canon Blaine was he a traveler of any description at all? Or did he, go around to see some of these establishments or operations and so on? Or was he just glued to the Rouen-Saint-Jean area?
Well, I, from what I know about him, I don't have the impression that he traveled very much, although he came originally from Noyon, which is in the west there someplace, but all the while he was in Rouen, he was in charge of several different groups of sisters as a canon, that was his apostolate. And at one time he was put in charge of a parish where there was a minor seminary. He didn't like that. He was stuck too much with it. But, so he, I don't think he traveled much, but he was acquainted with a lot of the religious. He was dealing with religious all the time as an ecclesiastical superior all the while he was in Rouen. That's a sheet I put together a few years ago to put in one place all of the references to the enemy, and it carries us through not just for what we have to look at today, but right straight through to the very end. Yes, Andy.
Do you have any kind of career as a writer besides doing the biography of conduct?
Not that I know of. I forget. Do you remember, Gus?
What's the question?
Did Bland write anything else much besides this biography?
He wrote the biography of two other of his friends who were holy.
Oh, that's right, Louis de Montfort. That's right.
And there's one other fellow whose name escapes me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was a close personal friend of Louis Grignon de Montfort. They were in seminary together, and they met several times and so on. And he wrote his biography. Yeah. Getting all these facts escape me terribly. What's the right staring me in the face? So we come to page 199 and the whole business of the secret enemy. Now the first problem is, who is it? Well, Bland seems to be enjoying himself playing with this question of the enemy and the schizophrenia here between the enemy and Chez-Tardy. He's trying to tell us all the time that the enemy is Chez-Tardy while he's insisting that he isn't, and he isn't giving any clues. I mean, who else could possibly qualify for all of the things that the enemy is doing in the context that he has and the concern? Page 199, the second paragraph. If we were to name this person now that he is dead, we would not consider ourselves to have blackened his memory, nor in any way have tarnished the outstanding reputation which he enjoyed all his life, and which is not buried in his tomb. And that's true. One of the most famous things about Chez-Tardy is that he was offered to be the Bishop of Poitiers, and he refused it. He said he had 65 reasons for refusing. He was 65 years old. Can understand that. It's nothing new for extremely worthy men to disagree, to adopt divergent behavior patterns, just look at Gus and myself, and to entertain contradictory views. A diversity of appreciations about how to procure the glory of God makes people oppose each other, so on and so forth. If it is true that the persecution suffered by God's favored children in this mortal flesh ordinarily come from the devotees of the world, it's no less true that similar contradictions arise from good people, etc., etc., etc. I'd like page 200, the next to the last paragraph. It was then nothing new if De La Salle had to endure persecution on the part of a person whose merits caused him to be highly regarded in Paris. If we do not reveal the name of this person and avoid giving any details which might arouse suspicion as to his identity, it's not because we feel that naming him might stain his memory, for he may have had the best intentions in doing what he did. The truth is that the pious persecutor of the innocent founder was right in disapproving of, and having condemned by superior authority, certain exaggerated and imprudent penitential practices. Clue right away, huh? But as these have been commanded, he should not have been held responsible, etc. So I have come little by little, to the start of this persecution of which we now speak. So. But, now he says he's not going to give any details, and that's because he may have had the very best intentions. But look at page 202. I have it noted for 202 here. But someplace along the line here, he talks about the enemy was the victim of a secret passion. And so he's imputed, down the bottom of 202, the very last paragraph. We can leave to him who reads the depths of minds and hearts to decide by what sort of casuistry De La Salle's former friend became his most redoubtable, although secret adversary. and to determine whether some secret passion disguised under the honorable aspect of zeal was not in reality the moving force which led him to stir up so much trouble. So often says the Imitations author, we are moved to passion and we call it zeal. When cupidity reigns, in appearance nothing but it's cupidity instead of charity. So he doesn't have any trouble whatsoever imputing intentions to him. So I get a big kick out of this. Okay, so then we come to the whole sequence here. So we can pretty well figure out who the secret enemy is, or at least who Bland says he is, but not completely. Mayafair, interestingly enough, when Mayafair talks about the secret enemy, he talks about the secret enemies. And Bland himself comes to a point rather later on in the narrative where he talks about they, and they, and they. So I think another way of thinking about the secret enemy, although there's no question that this whole episode is triggered by Chétardis blowing the whistle on De La Salle to the cardinal, I think that the whole thing, the whole pattern of the thing, the secret enemies, if you will, or the secret enemy in a collective sense, would be the Sulpicians. And the reason they were the secret enemy, of course, of De La Salle was because they saw the wonderful things the brothers were doing. They didn't see any reason why this couldn't be a permanent feature of the parish of Saint-Sulpice that they could control. It was really the attitude of Barmondier from the beginning. It was certainly Baudrin's view. It certainly is Chétardis' approach, and it continues after Chétardis in Dubroux, who will meet this morning and so on. So you could well say that in a certain sense, the secret enemy of the foundation of the Institute were the Sulpicians, who did everything they could to get hold of it and keep it for themselves. And I don't think that that's an unfair historical judgment in the light of the evidence. So although in one sense the enemy in this narrative is undoubtedly Chétardis, in a broader sense of the enemy of the foundation of the Institute, I think you have to say it was the pastors of the parish of St. Sulpice. Okay. All right. So what occasions this whole thing was these two wild directors that the founder appointed, and where he made serious errors of judgment, as Bland has already said. So we have this brother Michel, who's the director of novices, and brother Ponce, who's the director of this relatively large community in the Rue Princesse. Right? And so Michel was not at all beyond physically disciplining the novices, and raising welts on them and everything else, and not all of them took it. So some of them went to De La Salle to complain, but De La Salle did not listen to their complaints. He backed up the man he appointed, and he told them, well, just relax, it's good for you, and all this, and words to that effect and so on. But the real thing comes when, and so they go to the pastor. Obviously, if they're going to somebody, the only one they could possibly go to over the head of, and these incidents seem to have occurred with particular violence when De La Salle was away, when these guys felt free to get let loose. And so Ponce, who had one of the novices, was doing practice teaching in his school, and Ponce, who was a good schoolman, and he couldn't get anywhere with this novice, so he gets him. He goes over to the bishop, gets hold of him and so on, and he beats him physically, mercilessly, with a discipline, I suppose. Just told to lift up the robe. It's not clear whether sometimes you get the impression that they took the robe down from the shoulders and they beat them on the back, or sometimes they probably lifted up and beat them on the buttocks. But at any rate, they certainly raised welts. And so this guy goes to the pastor. So the pastor says, put it in writing. He wanted something he really saw. Now he's really got something on. This is what leads me to suspect that earlier incident with Campagnon, that calumnies might have had something to do with punishment too, maybe punishment of the students rather than the brothers. But did you read Bland's lovely defense of the business of corporal punishment and the way it was practiced in religious congregations? And so on page 209, 210, so on and so forth. Oh, you have all of this lovely S&M stuff. Turn, John. The story of Peter Damien, who has a reputation for being one of those gentle saints with a sense of humor. in the middle of 209. In this hermitage, there was a brother who left his cell for no reason. John, the prior of the hermitage, after having reproved him severely, had him whipped. When the guilty one was putting his clothes back on, he spoke arrogantly. Here, boy, the superior ordered him to strip him and whip him again, which was done. This happened 6 times.
Wow.
I remind you, what was that fellow in Roots? Remember the black fellow, Kinti Knuti, or whatever his name was? Get him to say his name. So he says, from now on I obey my superior. St. Romuald went after his father. He had him whipped. And so on and so forth. And then all these crazy examples. These examples show that even if it had been true that De La Salle had given occasion for these things, his fault caused only would have been sufficiently remedied by the reproof of the superior. That according to the testimony of brothers who lived nearly all the time with their holy founder who is still alive, he never gave occasion to these indiscreet penances, either directly or indirectly. He never authorized them or approved of them. They had taken place without his knowledge in his absence. Well, what the hell was going on at Vaugirard with all that stuff, etc., etc.? He certainly created a climate where this was just kind of taken for granted. This still goes on, you know, and some orders have corporal penance in their rule. We just got, we finally, after 15 years in our community of trying to run our own food service to feed 55 brothers, finally surrendered to Marriott, and we adopted the Marriott food service. And in a transition period, they gave us a manager who had been a lay brother with the Capuchins. And he left, he's married, and he's now working with the food service. He has now, as a layman, become a sort of Monsieur Jean. I said to them, for crying out loud, why did you give us such a pious Catholic manager who wears a cross around his neck all the time? So, and he writes letters against abortion to the local regional paper, the Riverdale Press there, things like that. And he's continually talking to the brothers about all this awful stuff that's what's going on in the church and the terrible things the changes have done, etc., etc., etc. Real wanderer type person. And I'm supposed to be the liaison with the kitchen. but anyway, this one day, I forget what brought it on. I guess it was something about the director insisting that we don't have meat served during Lent or something like that. And he said, he asked me if we had any, there's something about fast, and I talked about fast. He asked me if we had any corporal penance. I said, no, the founder explicitly excluded that. Well, he said all the while he was a Capuchin, that every Friday they all had to go, they all had a discipline, a medal thing, and they had to go to each one to a sort of a private corner and beat their buttocks for 15 minutes or something like that. And this they had to do this by rule. So maybe that has something to do with his with his conservatism. So anyway, this isn't completely, this tradition is around still. Okay. All right. So those are the complaints. Now, did you all read this? Yes.
Yes.
So we don't have to go over it in all gory detail. What do you want to say about it? Huh? Maybe I should shut up and you've all read it now. What strikes you in the whole thing? Yeah, okay, Fergus.
Just a question first, Luke. Has anyone done any research on the Archbishop's papers or anything? Do we know what
that occurred to me, you know. That occurred to me too, not to my knowledge. It's possible our Rose has done it. He would be the type who would look at that. See, I suppose one of the problems with a lot of this is that I know Rose has dug all over the National Archives in Paris and so on, which is probably where this stuff would be, because with the confiscations and everything at the French Revolution, an awful lot of the stuff that would have been in the hands of chancery offices and parishes would have been confiscated or destroyed or something like that. But I never thought to ask him that question, whether he has seriously tried to search into, or whether if there are diocesan archives, if he ever tried to get at them. I would imagine it would have occurred to him, and he may not have found anything. But that really occurred to me, that there must be some record of this stuff, or there must have been at the time. Mike?
The founder did not defend himself because he didn't want to give, that would be a way of giving credence to what they were saying. Actually, we need to show up in court.
Well, let's just limit ourselves now for the moment to this business with the Cardinal and Chez Tardy. Right? That's different. How about this, the whole business of the investigation, Pierrot coming to the house and all that sort of stuff? Now, again, in terms of sequence, if you notice, Blaine gives us dates to some extent. So the arrival of Pierrot to convey the news to the brothers, accompanied by Grieken, the new superior supposedly, that arrival was after Vespers on the first Sunday of Advent. The final compromise with Mardot, Abbe Mardot. Again, Abbe, remember, is simply father. Huh? It's the title for a diocesan priest. Doesn't mean he's an abbot. If he is an abbot, then he's always abbot of something. As we'll see with Abbe Clément, who was his limit. But so that final compromise that's worked out, saving face all around and so on, is on December the 8th. Huh? So this whole thing has to take place within the course of a week. All of these runnings back and forth. So it's a little difficult to reconstruct exactly what's going on here, huh? Because after the debacle, when the brothers absolutely refuse and shout the guy down, etc., and he tries to, poor old Pierrot is trying to weasel them in, but they're not. A marvelous dramatic scene, of course. In the movie, Burkhardt works this for all it's worth, and it's worth working. But when after that, the founder goes to the Cardinal, huh? And he goes to Pierrot, that marvelous expression when they threaten him with exile. The Cardinal's already taking action, getting Parliament ready to put a sentence in, and then he withdraws from that. And then the brothers go to Chez Tardy, and the brothers go to Pierrot, so all of this business is going on. Huh? And the best authentication we have of it all is that letter, which is still in the Mother House archives, that where when the brothers up in Law heard about this, they asked this priest who had been at Vaugirard and who was good friends with the founder to write to Paris. So he wrote to a friend of his, and the pastor of Villers wrote back to him and told him the whole story. And that the story is that the whole problem is Chez Tardy. If the two of them could get along, there wouldn't be any problem at all.
It seems inconsistent, but I thought Lasalle would encourage the brothers to obey the cardinal, including one of the priests, and do some fact for the priest not to.
Yeah, it is. But that whole business of, see, again, if you read the stuff from Yves Poutet, and by the way, I put out two new things today, that's more with the government authorities, but it applies to some of these instances that we're talking about there. But if you read the stuff in Yves Poutet, this was always a very kind of a delicate balance that he had to maintain, because he knew perfectly well that he had absolutely, there was nothing, he was not a religious superior in the technical sense of the word, huh? He had no authority to operate whatsoever except through the pastor of St. Sulpice, right? And who was directly under the control of the cardinal. That's why I spent a little bit of time in that way in the beginning, huh? So that all of the educational things were in the hands of the bishop, and through the bishop through the local parish priest. So he knew, in a certain sense, that if the cardinal moved in on this thing, there was nothing he could do, and coupled with the religious motivation of the notion that, well, this is the highest religious superior, and the brothers ought to obey. Let's not forget, however, see what's in the background here all the time too, is that, well, we're here only in 1702 and 1703, but the founder's tactic was to have an escape route to Rouen. And before all of this is, even before this is concluded, he's already got an establishment going up in Rouen. So just as he went from Reims to Paris, and now he goes from Paris to Rouen, and all of this expansion is going on while all this is going on. The founder, I guess, might have had a mentality that he was willing to let the Paris operation go down the tube. Quite possible. Gus, do you think?
I'm not sure that he was in Darnetal by that time.
Oh no, not at this particular moment. He's not. That's not until 1705. But whether that was in the back of his mind that he was already thinking, that he could let this thing go, and he.
I think Peter's brought up a very good point, and I don't know. My first reaction was that it was part of Lasalle's willingness to let go.
Yeah.
That if they're going to destroy the institute, well, I could see him thinking, it's a total contradiction of what we've been trying to do, and it's been brought on. I suspect at some point he said, I really have gone too far in all this mass relationship, because he changed things. It may have been a great learning lesson for him.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have had to have the attitude that the whole institute would go down the tubes with this thing, because he still had the Reims Center and he had other places, and so it wasn't unthinkable that he would have been ready to just drop the whole relation with this official center.
The other thing that struck me was they talk about they vowed to go south. They vowed to go south. That's why they're leading to this.
Well, of course, they vowed to God, but what the content of the vow was to obey the body of the society and the superior. So that's true. Yeah.
For these complaints up there, the Écolatre was always a priest, and did he have much power?
Oh, tremendous power. He was the diocesan superintendent of schools.
Sure.
That's a pretty powerful position.
It sounds good, but in actual fact, I always thought the person above him just...
Well, no, but here's Chez Tardy, a pastor of one of the biggest and most important parishes in all of Paris, and highly regarded and so on and so forth. And de La Salle, let's not forget, was not even a priest of the diocese. He's from Reims. He's a stranger and all that sort of stuff.
Now that you mentioned the body of the society, it's just interesting that while de La Salle was willing to let the Paris authorities have their way, the body of the society was not.
Yeah.
The monks revolted.
Yeah.
And probably is a good example of how much empowerment de La Salle packed to the brothers. Even that scene that I mentioned already of Madill thinking he's got them, and the brothers holding up, and look, we want him in writing.
Yeah.
It's terrific.
Yeah. And so all of these, Madill had to play his trump card and say, well, this fellow really isn't going to bother you very much, and he'll only come once a month. As a matter of fact, he only came once altogether after the whole thing was over. So if we look that for all it's worth, the story is exciting and interesting. One little interesting detail is when de La Salle prostrates himself at the feet of the cardinal, and Burckhardt dramatizes this in the movie too. But my affair has it otherwise. He has the cardinal receiving him. I meant to bring the translation of that. So there's, and how many times did he go to the cardinal and all that sort of stuff and so on. A lot of this to actually put this thing down in an exact proper sequence and to fit it in with the time between the first Sunday of Advent and December the 8th is a little difficult to get all that in there in that short space of time. So there are some problems with the details of it, but I think the basic story holds together quite well, and it's maybe you ought to take a look at that final compromise settlement on page 231.
On 228, towards the bottom of the page there, he praises Fisher for the Mardi very much. And says it was when they returned to brother this and he says to resolve the problem for him after giving him the rough time with the murder babies.
Yes, yeah. Well, and of course the brothers go to Chez Tardy too, and this is part of what makes reading this so fascinating, because you know perfectly well that Blanc is trying to say Chez Tardy is the secret enemy, and yet he's trying to have another Chez Tardy who's always doing these nice things, and try to make him look good every once in a while. And so. So, yeah, well, the conditions, the compromise, and so on and so forth. So Mado brings them all to the vicar general. I guess the point that I wanted to make here really was when they go to the vicar general, the whole question is whether or not these things are conditions. And so he wants the brothers to apologize. They're willing enough to do that. Most of the brothers kept silence. Actually, they cared little about the terms used, whether it was a favor or a condition. They were concerned about the reality of the things, page 232 in the Bible, not about words. To these men, determined to preserve their own manner of living, it made no difference if they used the most obsequious terms, provided they remained in possession of their rules and their rightful superior. But there was a certain ambiguity to it.
Right before that, well, I was thinking of Gus. He talks about the Salm being very legalistic in many ways, and it says here that the brothers demanded that they put the thing in writing, and I don't put it in writing to guarantee. And I was thinking of the legalistic line probably had passed off.
Well, yeah, I'd be more inclined, though, to think on this occasion that the brothers were pretty shrewd and they had already been hoodwinked and they didn't trust the son of a gun and they wanted to have some real document to make sure that this, and to do the same thing that Shaitardi did in the beginning by getting those complaints in writing from the brothers in the first place. When you're dealing with the ecclesiastical authorities, it's always a very good idea. So the sequel, of course, is when Shaitardi, Bricot, who was very embarrassed by the whole thing, and so on, a young priest, he said, oh, what the hell did I get myself into? And so he comes back once or twice. But then Shaitardi gets a successor appointed to Bricot, this Father de Bru, who will be a big problem later on. And so he goes around and tries to talk to the monks, and apparently there's some reality to this because he got through to a few of them. And he indicates a little later on that 8 or 9 of them left as part of the sequel of this whole episode. And of course those instances that he has here that are very, very telling and very interesting. First of all, the two of them that they know De La Salle has already set up a school that he's going to open. So the two of them go and present themselves, and they're ready to take the school over and all this difficulty. And so the two of them try to steal a school. And so De La Salle catches up with them. And then good old Michel and his friend, who leaps over the wall when they could have walked out the door in the middle of the night to go to the Trappist. And the Trappist fellow said to the back, that Michel must have been some kind of a character. And of course, he goes to Chartres, ultimately, where he dies of the plague. And of course, in the confrontation, when Michel tries to come to the defense of the founder, and it's Pirot who tips his hand and says, you son of a gun, you're the one who started this whole business. So, but then of more serious consequence was this, the trouble with Shaitardi continues over the business. The big pet in Shaitardi's eyes was this training school, this Sunday Academy thing that he had done. And so the two of the brothers involved in the Sunday Academy, all of a sudden, see, they know a little bit more than the others. They now have a marketable skill. They're teaching drawing and penmanship at an advanced level and all that sort of stuff to these in the Sunday school situation. And they had special training for this apparently. And so their students say, boy, you're doing this very, very well and so on. You could make a good living at this. And so the two of them just up and left. One of them died penniless and so on. God caught up with him, all right. And so on and so forth. But this meant the ruination of the Sunday school. But here again, the brothers are very interested. De La Salle tried to pick off somebody to take their place, but the brothers would have no part of it. Page 245. So he had the deuce of a job. He finally got one so that the school could start up again because he knew this was a pet project of Shaitardi. And when the thing closed down, Shaitardi cut off all its salaries. Well, see, they had that weapon all the time. They controlled the purse strings and so on and so forth. And they drew up a memorandum to Chetardie explaining why they didn't want to get into this. They didn't think the brothers should go in for any kind of advanced studies. It was a danger to their vocation. You have a tough job here if you believe in higher education. Huh? Bland is telling us that it leads to an early death, and the brothers are saying that it leads to the loss of a vocation, which of course, as a matter of fact, it has in a lot of instances. Of some of my best friends, as a matter of fact. But anyway, whether that was due to their higher studies or not is another question. But so the brothers prepare this memorandum and to De La Salle of explaining their position on this whole thing. And he's trying to persuade them, well, there's something we got to do if we want to keep in the good graces of the pastor. And so he goes to the pastor to try to explain why the Sunday Academy can't continue, because the brothers won't do it. And here's their memorandum. And so Chetardie says, you wrote it. And the pastor says, I did not. And so Chetardie says, you're lying. And that marvelous response, he said, well, with this lie on my lips, I'm going to say mass. In the state of mortal sin, supposedly, in the thinking of those two. So the final upshot of the whole thing is that De La Salle finally, it's at this point that he decides, well, there's probably something to this business about all this corporal penance. So he confiscates all of the disciplines, its own, with the blood on them. Doesn't Bland love to talk about the blood stains all over the place? And so he confiscates those, and he's no longer giving permissions for this type of penance and so on and so forth. And Bland thinks it's a terrible thing. And Bland says, well, from here on in, the Institute is never the same again, and that it doesn't have the same fervor that it did in the beginning, and it's too bad they ever had to do this, and what happens to this lovely example they gave. And so I guess most of us feel that the founder finally got some common sense about this business of abandoning self-inflicted punishment and physical punishment inflicted by the superior. Okay, so we'll come back to this afternoon at 11 o'clock.